American history is filled with great moments of triumph. The Bay of Pigs invasion is not one of them. It was an event which saw the United States aid Cuban exiles in invading Cuba with the intent of overthrowing its new communist ruler, Fidel Castro. In case you're wondering, it failed miserably. But given the sheer disparity in power between the United States and Cuba, how did it fail? Surely victory in Cuba would have been easy. So first, a bit of background. After half a decade of turmoil, the Cuban government was overthrown by a communist revolution, and a certain Fidel Castro was placed in charge of the country. Castro soon seized foreign-owned assets, mostly American, and demanded American troops leave the country, with the exception of Guantanamo Bay, which was legally not a part of Cuba anymore, and so Castro had no authority there. This nationalization of mostly everything cost American businesses and the US government a great deal of money, which upset them. What really annoyed them, though, was that their old allied neighbor was now friends with their ideological opponents in the USSR. As such, Castro had to go, and President Eisenhower ordered the CIA to make plans for the overthrow of the Cuban government. However, Eisenhower wouldn't get to do anything about it since his term was up, and in 1960 he was replaced by John F. Kennedy, who ran on a strong anti-communist platform. And as such, Kennedy would have to act on Castro or he'd look like a fool. He was presented with two plans for overthrowing Castro. Plan 1 was for a US-backed invasion from the south, whereby rebels would depart from Nicaragua and seize Trinidad. The Cuban city, that is, not the island. These rebels would then set up a new government there, which the US would then promptly recognize and support in the war, along with the Cuban people who would inevitably rise up against Castro. Plan 2 was for the exiles to land here in the Bay of Pigs with very little direct American assistance. The idea was that they would land, secure a beachhead, begin a guerrilla war, and then the Cuban people would rise up to support them. Kennedy wanted plausible deniability, and so he opted for Plan 2. The forces landed in Cuba, and within 3 days they'd been completely defeated. So what went wrong? Well, first of all, Kennedy's insistence on having deniability meant that the Cuban exiles were poorly supported, and the 1,500 of them were easily outmatched by Cuba's military. Kennedy was in a tough spot. If he directly aided the exiles, he'd have risked upsetting the USSR and escalating things. And if he'd have done nothing, he'd have looked weak on communism, and also the USSR might have access to America's front yard. Much of the failure was down to the lack of American air support for the exiles, which would have certainly tipped some things in their favor. But Kennedy, even when he knew the invasion was failing, refused to send in the Air Force. And the reasons for this were that 1. America's previous foray into Korea and its current one in Vietnam weren't exactly proving to be riveting quick successes. And 2. The CIA had told him that even without air support they'd expected the exiles to win, since it was inevitable that the Cuban people would rise up against their communist overlords. One problem though, Castro was proving to be quite popular, and so the Cuban people were largely outraged at this foreign-backed invasion, and his popularity soared afterwards. The exiles were all killed or captured, and had the US made a greater contribution, they could have potentially succeeded. Although, as the CIA would soon learn, not with the support of the Cuban people.